great to be here, and thank you so much to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to participate in this wonderful event. So we are obviously celebrating Mark's birthday today, but more generally, I think the network that Mark has created over his career, and thinking about my place in this network, which is, I mean, for many of you who've been so closely working with Mark as researchers, that hasn't actually been the case for me. So I've unfortunately never written a paper with Mark. I hope actually I won't say exactly that a few years from now, but that is the truth so far. However, I have written papers with Raluca, who I was very fortunate to have as a postdoc after she finished her PhD with Mark. And consequently, my Mark Lewis number is 2. And I was actually wondering, that is there anybody here who has a Mark Lewis number greater than 2? I bet there isn't. But in any case, there is a network of collaboration. But it's not just Mark's contribution is obviously not just in research. He's been so active in community building and organizational things and service to the community. And if you were to count that as interactions, I'm sure we would all have a Mark Lewis number of 1, having interacted with him in those ways as well. So, and I think there's a really key reason for that, and that is that I think, and everybody could say this here, it's really enjoyable to interact with Mark, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart, both scientifically and personally. So that's why we're all here, and why this is a fun event. So, I would say that it's really, I feel, his ability to be so productive, amazingly so, both in research and in service to the community. And I mean, it's really inspirational. So I certainly have admired him throughout my career in mathematical biology for that reason. So I'm really pleased to be participating here. Okay, so today I'm going to begin with a bunch of what would normally be a late slide, which is acknowledgement. So I'm listing a bunch of colleagues and some students, postdocs, who've been involved in the research that I'm going to talk about. And unfortunately, Mark Lewis is not on this list. But I also wanted to emphasize, I always point out, oh yes, and thank you very much to these funders. But what I'm going to talk about today is projects in which I have led the digitization of historical data. And unlike so much of what mathematicians do, where, okay, if you didn't have money for a postdoc or a student, you could still sit in your office and do some math. These are things that there's no way could ever get done without really substantial investment from these funders. So I really do appreciate it. And I've been lucky to have funding from these various organizations to a large extent. These are really big projects that I will show you the outcomes of. So what I want to do, and I should say I'm going to, it's late in the day already. I am not going to show you a single equation in this talk. I just want to give you a sense of some amazing data that I feel is interesting because it reveals disease ecology. And these are data that are, some of which are very old and have been hard to obtain and make usable, but I hope you'll find interesting. And there is an alternative title that I thought of for this talk, which is data that Mark Lewis hasn't worked on. But should, and I know that Mark agrees. Yeah. So just want to help him out now. Okay, so the first disease I want to talk about is plague. Caused by Yersinia pestis. Okay, well, if you're thinking about plague, one of the things that may come to mind right away is the Great Plague of London, which took place in 1665. And if you want to learn about the Great Plague of London, well, it might be interesting to learn about people who were there, So this is actually I'm sure this is Mark Lewis at age 46. This is a later later portrait. Yeah, actually, Mark is only 60, not 360. This is in fact Isaac Newton. And the reason I mention Newton is that during the Great Plague of London, he was a 22-year-old research fellow in Cambridge, and the university closed because of fear of the plague coming to Cambridge. And during that time, he isolated himself in his country house. I mean, this is something we've all experienced recently. Well, maybe not quite that level of isolation, but during that time when he was isolated for a few months, he developed calculus, optics, and his universal law of gravitation. And, that's pretty good. But I mean, if we think about it, if it had been Mark who was there, I mean, we've done more than that. Anyway, thinking about the quality of science that Newton did, I mean, if we're thinking about how we can learn about the Great Plague of London, then what do we need? We need to describe the spread of plague in a human population, and to do that, we need some sort of written records that we can still gain access to today. Ideally, they're very systematic over the course of the epidemic. In the best case, we would have a death certificate of every individual who died from plague during the Great Plague. But what can we actually obtain in practice? Well, to get the answer, we should go to London and think about when London looked like this and not like it does from that aerial view more recently. And I'm sure most of you are aware that the City of London kept weekly records called the Bills of Mortality. This is an example here that had 2 pages. And the first page on the left lists causes of death and the number of individuals whose death was attributed to that cause in that week. And if we look at a few particular things, I've blown that up here. So there was somebody who was frightened to death, 3 people who died of grief, and more than 5,000 people in this city of 500,000 that died in this 1 week of plague. So this is a pretty bad time. Well, data like that, the bills of mortality, are extremely helpful. When we type in the numbers, we can get a sense of the pattern of the epidemic. And but the Great Plague wasn't the first plague. In fact, of course, you've all heard of the Black Death in the 14th century. It was long before 1665. So one of my interests has been to try to find data for the earlier plague epidemics and see if we can learn something by comparing the Great Plague to the early epidemics. So the problem is that the bills of mortality didn't begin until 1563, so they won't go back to the 14th century. There are some earlier records from parish registers, but that only started in 1538. And that's when deaths first began to be registered in England. So we did something that historians have done for other purposes, which is looked at last wills and testaments and counted up surviving last wills and testaments during the known plague epidemics. And those go back to the 13th century. And so we were able to get some data about the pattern of these early plague epidemics. So here's what we found in the 14th century. This is on a log scale. So these are counts of wills, and those really are big peaks, remember, on the log scale. And I've highlighted in yellow the known plague epidemic from the time of the known plague epidemics. And so these wills correspond exactly, the peaks in the wills correspond exactly to the known plague epidemics. And of course, later, these early wills, I actually typed in 1,100 wills myself to get these data. But later on, the dates of the wills have all been, there are millions of them that have been digitized in the archives of London. And so if you plot the whole sequence, you see this. Then I mentioned the parish register data, which we also have. So weekly counts of people who died from all causes. And And then the red here is the actual bills of mortality, which are deaths from plague, categorized from plague. Okay, so that's a sort of overall view of the data. Here's a couple of examples of the plagues in the 14th century, and you can see these really do look like noisy epidemic curves. It's just numbers of wills over time, and it goes through the period where there was a known plague epidemic. Then later in the 17th century, we have the three sources of data, which I've scaled. The numbers aren't similar, but the peaks occur at roughly the same time. Okay, so we have these three sources of data, and I said what we really wanted to do was compare these various epidemics and see if we can learn something about the dynamics of these plague epidemics and maybe about changes in the disease or whatever. So is it okay to make a comparison? Because in the we've got wills only in the 14th century. Later we have mortality and wills. And to answer that, here's the Great Plague of London. So this is now for the first time plotting up these the weekly counts, and this is weekly counts of wills scaled so that the peak is at the same level. And you can see that actually, I'm going to highlight here the period of growth, of very fast growth. You can see the slope is basically the same. And so that suggests very strongly that we will be okay at comparing the initial growth rate of the epidemics based on wills. And that is very exciting, I think, because it means that in spite of the fact that there's no mortality data and there's no chance of ever getting mortality data, we can make some comments about these early plague epidemics. And what did we find when we make them? So remember, I'm leaving out all the analysis. So you get the punchline. What we found was that the later plagues in the 17th century grew 4 times faster than in the 14th century. Huge difference. And to get a sense, people usually have a better sense of time than rate. The doubling time in the 14th century was about 45 days and only about 11 days in the 17th century. It's an enormous difference in the rate at which this plague was initially spreading. So then, of course, you might ask, well, why was there this acceleration of plague spread? And we don't know the answer to that. So we're going to leave that to Mark to figure out. But there are lots of sort of obvious hypotheses, one being that maybe there was evolution of increased infectiousness, longer infectious period, maybe it's because of changes in population density, which certainly occurred, in social structure. There's a ton of things that changed over those centuries. There were also changes in weather, and actually I was thinking about this during Peter's talk, that this may be an interesting opportunity to apply some of that kind of modeling, because you may be aware that there was something called the Little Ice Age in Europe, which the lowest point of which was during the 17th century. And so there was a big difference actually in weather between the 14th and 17th century. Maybe that was very relevant. Another issue that we could spend a very long time talking about is whether the spread was really rat to flea to human spread causing bubonic plague, or whether it was human to human spread, pneumonic plague. Both are caused by the same organism. Okay, good. So on the issue of bubonic or pneumonic plague, I'll just mention that, so beyond the issue of just, I think it's interesting that the plague epidemic spread so much more quickly later on. But if we want to ask the question of, was it bubonic or pneumonic plague, then something like the growth rate isn't good enough. We have to know something about the transmission mode of the disease. We're trying to forget the transmission. We have to know something more about the disease natural history. And so we considered the possibility, suppose it was pneumonic plague, and suppose it was pneumonic plague exactly like pneumonic plague that has been studied carefully more recently. And so that the latent and infectious period distributions are just like modern pneumonic plague. Let's have a thought experiment about that. If we make that assumption, then, and use our growth rate estimate, then we find that it must be that about 20% of the population of London was infected with plague in the 14th century. But any historical record that you look at suggests that at least 30 and often 50% of the population of London in fact died from plague in 1348. So that's very suggestive that strictly pneumonic plague probably wasn't what happened in the 14th century. And well, you may say, well, that's not, the strongest scientific conclusion that you might have come to, but just think about this. We're able to say that these early plagues probably were not primarily pneumonic plague. And how are we doing that? We're doing that ultimately because we've counted wills that have survived from the 14th century. And that I think that's actually kind of amazing, that we can, from counting up wills that people wrote in the 14th century, we can make an inference that's not certain, but is certainly suggestive of the mode of transmission of a disease at that time. Okay, so great. The next thing I want to talk about is, which is more of up Mark's alley, is the spatial dynamics of plague in London. And you may, and so what kinds of questions we're interested in here is, if you look at the Great Plague of London, is there evidence of spatial spread, or did it just very quickly go through the whole city, which it was a very small city, a couple of square miles, so it might have spread quickly enough that that you don't see spatial spread. Can we explain the invasion dynamics? Can we explain the dynamics of the full epidemic spatially? Okay, so we can address those questions because of the second page in the Bills of Mortality. So that lists all the 130 parishes of London together with the number of people who were buried in total or whose death was attributed to plague in that week. And I just, as an interesting comment, I'll say that that was a typeset reprinting of a bill of mortality. Most of the bills that we digitized were like this. So they were like forms that had handwritten numbers in them. But fortunately, the numbers are uniformly extremely clearly written. So the handwriting in these documents is fantastic. So we have, with a lot of effort, digitized all these records. Okay, so let's look at the initial spread of the Great Plague of London. So here, this is this is London, the Thames River highlighted in yellow. It was a walled city. The Wall of London is also highlighted in yellow. The black bar is London Bridge, which was the only bridge across the river at the time, and the red outlines are the parish boundaries. And underneath the sort of gray is a later map of London, which when I made this, I stuck in there because I know London reasonably well and I wanted to know where I was. And so, but it wasn't actually as densely populated as that suggests. Okay, so what I'm going to do is color the parishes in the sequence in which they were infected. That is, in the sequence in which somebody was reported to have died from plague in that parish. And so ask yourself as I scroll through this, which is 1 week at a time, whether you see spatial spread or if it was random. So it began in a parish outside the walls at the edge of the city, and then seemed to spread near to it, made a bit of a jump. It's still outside the city walls, but then in this week, it seems to have penetrated through, there's actually a main gate to the city right there and across the river from this point. And then as we go forward, I think it's fairly evident that over time there is encroachment onto the very center of the city. And remember, this is weekly, so this is taking months to occur to get all the way to the center of the city. And there does appear to be some randomnesses, like why does it jump around? And one thing I would say there is that remember that these are death data, and somebody could be infected in a parish, but not die until somebody who was infected later died in a different parish. So it's consistent, I think, probably with fairly smooth spread. Very interesting. So actually, in terms of time, when do you want me to end? I don't remember what time I started, but
we've got tea break at 4, so we've got I think we've got a bit 10 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So I could skip this, but I'll just. So the CBC made a documentary about. So I was involved with a colleague in the actual sequencing of the genome of the Black Death, and they made a Nature of Things special about it, and they spent hours and hours filming me, showing Hendrik Poinar, my colleague, who's the evolutionary geneticist, that graph going through from different angles, whatever. I thought this was going to appear. No, it wasn't good enough. They redid everything. They had their graphics professionals redo the animation that I had done myself. So I'll just quickly show you that. And so here it is. This is, the CBC graphics specialists. And then they have David Suzuki over top talking about, and then, there was spread. It was terrible. All these people were dying, and it was around the walls of the city. And then suddenly they get close to they were listening to me about it going through the wall. And then David Suzuki says, in a flash, the plague burst through the gate of the city and infected the rest, and very quickly, infected the rest of it. And it was all beautiful and very exciting to see this. And I sat scratching my head thinking, okay, they spent a lot of money, did all of this. They didn't pay any attention to the actual data. Like, there's no correspondence really with to where anything happened. And also, they had David Suzuki in the script saying they burst through when I, for 5 hours, I went over and over saying that what's most amazing about this is how slowly it went. It took months to, okay. Good. So an interesting spatial spread problem, and yeah. So there you go. There's the next problem for Mark. Good. So what I've shown you is just the initial spread of the Great Plague of London, but of course we have the data for the entire epidemic. So let me just show you that. So here, if you look in the top right, I don't know if you can see it, there's actually a date. We're in February, March, April 1665, and when we hit May, all of that initial spread that I showed you, it's over already. And the first bar that you saw pop up was in the middle, actually, and this is per capita deaths. And so all of that initial spread happened with very, very low levels, but then the plague itself was just, it just raged everywhere over the course of months. And then, so now we're in September of 1665, around the time of that bill that I showed you with 5,000 deaths, and then it sort of starts to die down. But it actually takes a full year until late in 1666 of smoldering before it burns out altogether. Okay. On to another disease. So influenza. So just over a century ago in Ontario, this was the pattern of all-cause deaths, with a giant spike due to H1N1 invading, the world. And below this, I'm showing, so that the black is all-cause deaths, the red is deaths attributed to influenza on the death certificate, and green is influenza or pneumonia, which is actually the normal way that we categorize mortality for influenza, because so much pneumonia death is actually ultimately due to influenza. Well, there's a lot I could say about this, but the data that I've plotted here are actually individual level data. We it was a multi-year project digitizing every single one of the 60,000 death certificates from people who died in Ontario in 1918. And so we have a complete record of mortality for 1918, which we're only beginning to look at, but is a really exciting data set. We actually have the name and address of every individual and their date of birth, a duration of illness before they died, and all sorts of other information. So it's a very exciting database. So, yeah, another problem for Mark to work on. Good. So I'll just, I've spent a lot of time actually thinking about influenza, and in particular in 1918. This is the data from London, England again, during 1918. And here you can see very clearly that there were 3 waves of influenza in 1918. And I think this is really the primary reason that when the COVID pandemic started, people said, oh, there's going to be multiple waves. Probably there's going to be 3 waves. I heard that so many times. Reporters asked me multiple times, do you think there will be 3 waves of COVID? Why might there have been 3 waves? And when I say why 3 waves, why within a single 12-month period would there be 3 waves? Because that's totally abnormal for influenza. Usually there's 1. So we did a bunch of modeling of this. The red is the data that I just showed you, and the black is box plots of 1,000 realizations of a stochastic epidemic model that includes changes in behavior in response to being aware of lots of death in the community. It also includes schools opening and closing. It includes an effect of weather on influenza transmission, which is known to exist. So when we put everything in, the best fit model actually includes all those effects and clearly fits very well. So then we wanted to know, well, just how important are each of these things? Well, if we leave out the behavioral response, we cannot fit the 3 waves. Just with weather and school closures, it isn't possible to get any kind of reasonable fit to the 3 waves. So that suggests that behavioral response to its spreading in the community was an important factor. When we leave behavior in but leave out school closures, we get a less good but still pretty decent fit. And similarly, if we leave out weather and include schools and behavior, we get a reasonable fit. But so there's evidence that statistically, there's evidence that all 3 factors are important, but by far the most important is behavioral response. Okay, another disease that I've been fascinated by, smallpox, which fortunately was eradicated in 1980. So again, from the London Bills of Mortality, this is to my knowledge, the longest infectious disease time series, well, at least weekly time series that anybody has ever digitized. And it goes from 1664 up to 1931. After that was one of the last, there was only 1 more death from smallpox in London in 1934. So this is the whole history that we have of smallpox. And you can see that there were recurrent epidemics. And if you spend time looking closely at it, of course, I encourage you to read this paper, which came out in 2020 with my student, Olga Krylova. There were lots of changes in the frequency of epidemics. You can see that a bit because later on, they're regular but less frequent in that period. But there's a lot more going on. But Olga pulled together a ton of other data, including birth rates over this period, and studied a whole bunch of historical records and was able to figure out when all sorts of policy changes happened, when there were wars, when nature of the data being collected changed for one reason or another, and critically, when the vaccine was invented and how much it was used, and also when the process of variolation started. Variolation was when this process by which they scraped scabs from somebody who was sick with smallpox and intentionally infected somebody else with the idea that they would become infected but wouldn't become as sick as if they had inhaled smallpox and become infected in a normal way. And that was in fact true. It worked, except that, well, sometimes not so well, and the person died anyway. Anyway, this is a fascinating story. And I'll just tell you a bit of the upshot, which is that if you look at changes in birth rate and contact rate and so on, you can predict changes, in disease dynamics. And that is a theme of a lot of the things that I've studied in childhood diseases and things over the years. And I'll just very quickly say that there are tons of other data of these sort that I did not discuss today, but that I and my group and Mark very soon are going to be studying. But there is one thing that I wanted to just take a moment to mention, which is, so together with Carolyn Colleen at SFU and Mark and some others here and over the country, we're one of 5 networks of infectious disease modelers that have been trying to do work during the pandemic and got some funding from NSERC. And a key thing that we've been trying to do is reverse the lack of historical information about Canada's notifiable infectious diseases. And so what we've been doing, and this is another big project which will be, I hope, finished and released, at least the first release, sometime next year. A lot of effort to collect data, some of which are handwritten, for each province since 1924, when the Dominion Bureau of Statistics came into existence. We scan all these documents, and we get an army of students to type in all the data in exactly the format that they are in the original documents, so that it's easy to cross-check between the entered data and the originals. And then we write software scripts that harmonize the different forms of the data and so on, and create nice, tidy data sets that everybody can use. And that's really going to be good for the future as Mark solves a lot more problems. So, very good. Happy birthday. So thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Mark, for inspiring this nice event. And I look forward to celebrating again in 60 years. Well, hopefully before that too.